It's time for our first panel of the day, Resilience Planning in the Northeastern Coastal States, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panel moderator, Joe Maroon. Joe is the Executive Director of the Virginia Environmental Endowment. VEE has been a supporter of VCPC since the beginning, and we're very grateful for their continued partnership. Joe has been leading VEE since 2013. Prior to that, he served as the agency director of the Virginia Department of Conservation, and Recreation, and also as the first Virginia executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Please welcome Joe Maroon.
Good morning. It's a great crowd. As Angela said, VE has been a funding partner of the Coastal Policy Center and these conferences since the beginning, way back in 2013, which doesn't seem all that long ago, but it's now been 7 years. And in our view, the center, along with its many partners, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, the Virginia Coastal Policy Center, the Virginia Sea Grant Program, the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program, ODU, UVA, Wetlands Watch, and many, many others, provide a valuable niche, has filled a valuable niche by providing science-based legal and policy analysis of issues affecting the state's coastal resources and communities, and providing that information and advice to a host of Virginia's decision makers in the public and private sectors. In 2017, as part of our 40th anniversary, the endowment identified 22 out of 500 partners as partners in excellence, and very pleased to say that the center was one of those 22. The job of resilience planning at state, regional, or local levels is extremely important, especially in the light of the inaction at our national level, as Secretary Strickler has just mentioned. We are seeing coastal states leading the way in trying to address the complex challenges of safeguarding people and infrastructure, facilitating commerce, and managing coastal resources. As we've already heard from our state leaders this morning, Virginia's efforts are taking shape, but as Admiral Phillips alluded to, we still have a long way to go. Some localities and regions have jumped out ahead, along with the military and universities, some nonprofits, and some in the business community. And there are several philanthropic foundations that are interested in climate resilience and hopefully will be a partner as things move ahead. The conference planners felt that it would be instructive for all of us to hear what our colleagues in other states and in the private sectors are doing. So this first panel is focused on resilience planning in the northeastern coastal states. We have three very knowledgeable panelists to tell us their stories of how the 3 Ps, planning, partnerships, and paying for it all, are playing out in their jurisdictions. I haven't seen one of our panelists yet this morning, but I understand someone has picked up her badge, so I'm trusting that she's here. Okay, very good. I got a thumbs up, so excellent. So you have their bios in the program, so let me briefly introduce them. Our first speaker will be Sandy Hertz. Sandy is Assistant Director of the Office of Environment within the Maryland Department of Transportation. Sandy brings over 20 years of experience in environmental protection to her current role, in which she coordinates environmental compliance, water and natural resource stewardship, and climate risk and resilience efforts for MDOT and the Maryland Transportation Authority. Sandy serves on several agency work groups, including the Adaptation and Resilience Working Group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. As we work our way north, Sandy will be followed by Sean O'Rourke. Sean is the Director of Stormwater and Resilience at the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, and he serves as the Chief Resilience Officer for the state of Rhode Island. He previously served as the National Green Infrastructure Director at the Trust for Public Land, an organization many of us have worked with, and was Director of Sustainable Design at the Boston Architectural College, where he continues to serve as a member of the faculty. And then our final speaker will be John Cleveland. John is not from Cleveland. He's actually here representing Boston. John is the executive director for the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, a network of business and civic leaders supporting the implementation of the city's Climate Action Plan and the Climate Ready Boston Initiative and the Carbon Free Boston Initiative as well. John is also president and co-founder of the Innovation Network for Communities, a national nonprofit organization focused on helping cities achieve carbon neutrality and long-term resilience to climate disruptions. So with those introductions, we'll have Sandy come up and she'll make her first presentation. We'll go through the 3 presentations and then we'll have time for questions, we hope.
Good morning. As Joe mentioned, my name is Sandy Hertz. I'm here to present on resiliency planning for Maryland. Most of the discussion at the beginning of my presentation is going to be focused on statewide efforts, and then I'm going to spend a few slides talking about what we're doing specifically in the transportation sector. So I don't think that there's a lot of transportation folks in the audience, so I'm just going to ask for a show of hands for those that work closely with transportation or are in transportation. Okay, so I have 6 people I can look to as friends, so it's fantastic. Thank you to the Virginia Coastal Policy Center for allowing me to crash your party, and for the opportunity to share the great work that's occurring in Maryland. So with that, I don't know, do I control this somehow?
You can, there's a remote there. Green to go forward.
Oh, okay. Awesome. So if you don't know, Maryland is the state immediately to the north of Virginia. I know that there's people from all over the country, so we have 23 counties, 14 of which are in the coastal area, along with the city of Baltimore. We have approximately 3,200 miles of shoreline, so there's a lot of coastal area. Sea levels along our coastlines are rising 3 and sometimes 4 times faster than other areas globally. And right now, I think the last count was that we have had 13 islands go underwater since, I guess, rising sea levels have started to occur. We're one of the top 3 states vulnerable to 2 feet of sea level rise by the year 2050. So there's a lot of water coming our way in those counties. In 2018, the city of Annapolis, which is our state capital, had over 42 instances of nuisance flooding, which is sunny day flooding. So not associated with a storm, but just high tides. All right, so when faced with the prospect of presenting at an academic university, I turned to my most reliable source, which was Google, to find out, what's the recipe for success. So what I found out is when you search for how to create a resilient future, you get something like 180 million results. A little daunting. And then when you add in the word coastal, it narrows it down to like 28.7 million. So since I only signed up to give this presentation last week, I thought, I don't have time to do that research, so I'm just going to share with you what I believe are the, the main factors in the success that we've seen so far in Maryland. So I offer you the 3 C's, which also happen to align with your 3 Ps. Coordination and consistency in our planning and partnering efforts, and currency in terms of data resources as well as funding for strategic planning and implementation. So, as was mentioned, I do serve on a number of state commissions and councils. I have a friendly table right in front of me that's related to the first one that's mentioned up here. So back in 1984, Maryland was lucky enough to have a governor and a General Assembly that enacted the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Protection Program and established the Critical Area Commission. And one of the things that Critical Area Commission served to do is to really look at the effect of land use decisions that are occurring within 1,000 feet of mean high water. We looked at the types of development, the land use in terms of concentration of residents, whether it was an open space or there was industry in those areas. And they developed a method to minimize the adverse effects of human activities on water quality and habitat in those areas. And it was an effort to foster a consistent and more sensitive development within those areas. It was also the first step towards limiting development in vulnerable areas while establishing a buffer, which was designed to prevent or reduce erosion by stabilizing slopes and the shoreline. The buffer itself is maintained at a distance of 100 feet adjacent to all tidal waters. So we started back in 1984 with thinking about our coastal threats and how we can protect both the infrastructure that already exists and the residences that were in those areas. So Critical Area Commission was our first, I would say, statewide coordination effort. Secondly, in 2007, an executive order was signed by former Governor O'Malley, establishing a climate change commission. This commission was tasked with developing an action plan to prepare for climate impacts on Maryland. It created several working groups, one of which I currently serve on, the Adaptation and Resiliency Work Group. There's also a scientific and technical work group. There's 4 total, but I'm only going to hit the ones that are super cool. So, but basically, the scientific and technical work group focuses on including current and future climate models and forecasts and developing, mapping, and strategic tools for us to use to better plan for development and infrastructure placement within coastal areas of Maryland. The Adaptation and Response, or Resiliency, just recently renamed. Originally it was Response, now it's Resiliency. I don't know if that's because of you all, but thank you. Overall, their purpose was to ensure continued attention, accountability, and transparency in the implementation of strategies and plans that are developed through the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. So both of those working groups really serve to help foster, I guess, a community ethic towards better resilient planning for Maryland. And finally, the Coast Smart Council was established in 2014, also, I believe, by executive order. I'm not sure, or it might have been legislation. I'm looking at Emily in front here. I think it might have been legislation. Thank you. For the purpose of establishing siting and design criteria to address impacts associated with coastal flooding and sea level rise on future capital projects. So in 2014, we really started looking at how we were spending our state funding and capital funding on structures in particular. And that's the beginning of really regulating, I would say, how people are building within our coastal areas beyond just what was already being done by the Critical Area Commissions. So I think these things are super cool. So what I did was I took the membership from those 3 different groups and I gave everybody a category just to see what the membership was comprised of. So when we talk about consistency in Maryland, we have a number of these councils that have consistency in terms of the people that serve on them. So I serve on all 3 of the councils and the commissions that I just mentioned, but in addition to that, we have counties that participate in this. It's very important to have the locals involved in the planning because it most significantly impacts them. We have folks from academics. We have folks from the Treasury Department. We have planning. We have a lot of state agencies involved to help us share a conversation and have touch points on the different program areas in each of these different agencies that can impact and influence the success of these programs. So I think one of the things that has helped us is having consistent representation. And many of the people that serve on the Coast Smart Council also serve on these other councils too. So it's a lot of consistency in terms of messaging between the different groups, which is fantastic. So I guess I could look there. There's actually a little cheater monitor here for future speakers. So in terms of consistency across programs, Maryland has an open data portal, and this isn't unusual. Most states have a GIS clearinghouse, but what is fantastic is that counties, state government, even private citizens can go into this open data portal and have access to information that is as current as possible. So sea level rise projections and coastal mapping. And I think one of the other things about the open data portal is that we're leveraging data that was generated through the efforts of partnering agencies. So there's a higher level of confidence in projections because of the collaboration and input from stakeholders in the process. And I think that's very important. So whether your project is being reviewed by the Critical Area Commission or going before the Board of Public Works for capital funding approval, there's also consistency in how Maryland leadership is looking for planning and use of state funds. So compliance resilience checklists occur within the Critical Area Commission. As you review projects, you look to see where they're placing them with regard to the critical area, but you also have to look at whether or not they have incorporated ecosystem resiliency measures into those projects. If it goes before the Coastmark Council, we also have a construction criteria that we have to follow. So I'll get into it a little bit more in the final bullet on this slide, but essentially there's consistency between the programs as they review state-funded projects. Ecosystem resiliency features. It is critically important to think about natural and nature-based features when we look to our coastal communities. Nobody wants to see some sort of Lord of the Rings great flood wall in their front yard. They would much rather see a marsh habitat and it's something natural and visually, aesthetically pleasing. So we look in our project areas to incorporate as much as we can natural and nature-based features. And in particular, as was mentioned earlier, the co-benefits of putting something like that in does everything from carbon sequestration to protection of shorelines to improving water quality. So very important to incorporate across our programs. And consideration of project life cycle. I'm from transportation. We look at life cycle all the time. So we historically take into account normal wear and tear, on our construction materials, operations and maintenance, and future land use implications. But another shift in Maryland's approach in project life cycle planning is with respect to future sea level rise or storm surge implications. So that's a significant change from, say, 5 to 10 years ago in Maryland. And finally, Maryland leadership recognizing the potential vulnerability of state capital investments passed bills in 2018 and 2019, bills that Emily and I are very familiar with, that established the need for coast-smart siting and design criteria to address not only sea level rise and coastal flood inundation, but the effects of storm surge on existing infrastructure. Now, many of you know that storm surge is very difficult to model. So one of the challenges that we have in Maryland is figuring out a way to have a surrogate to address the storm surge issue that we're being asked to consider. So just from an MDOT transportation example, we can add a freeboard similar to what was mentioned earlier of 3 feet, say, above the 100-year base flood elevation. But to accurately predict what the storm surge would be along all 3,200 miles of shoreline in Maryland based on all of the variables that occur in any given storm situation is very difficult. So one of the challenges we have in transportation and other infrastructure planning is figuring out how we can build to be resilient to those storm surges, but also able to recover quickly from them. So we don't want to elevate our roads per se by 5 feet, because once the storm surge goes down, all of that water may be backed up on somebody else's property. So how do you account for meeting the requirements to address storm surge, but also make sure that you're not flooding out the neighbors? So that's one of the things that we're challenged with. But, and I'm not going to cue you yet, but one of the things that I wanted to share with you today is the approach that we're also taking at a statewide level. So through some funding that was received from NOAA, Maryland Department of Natural Resources started the Maryland Climate Leadership Academy back in 2018. So I have a brief 3-minute slide or a presentation that I want to share with you, and then I'll follow it up with a really dry graphic just to keep you guys awake. So.
It doesn't look like it's going to be that bad if you just look around you today. If you think about what it takes to redesign a city, to change the whole operations of a Fortune 500 company, these are things that don't happen in a day or two.
We've been occupying the same areas, doing the same thing for many generations, and our land is sinking.
The Bay resources are so tremendous. The economies that they support translate across the state of Maryland.
The ability for watermen and farmers to continue business as usual is changing, and that's a direct result of the changing environment in which we live.
Just about ground zero in Maryland for the effects of climate change.
It's not really the future for Dorchester County, it's here.
We're really excited about the launch of a Climate Change Academy here in Maryland. It is a first for us.
The connections, network space, and resources that the rural communities are going to need to tackle these issues.
If you're a planner, if you're a civil engineer, if you're an architect, if you're a risk management professional, coming together and working together, then you can drive transformation in a community. If they're working independent of one another, then you can't.
It's a fitting venue for people of all perspectives and training and background to converge.
It's today, I would say even yesterday. The longer we wait, the more disservice we're doing to the members of our communities.
The Climate Academy takes that first big step, and it moves that conversation, and it trains the decision makers.
We're already seeing occupations who are looking at their codes of ethics and conducts and saying the world is changing, we need to evolve these standards. It's one thing to put it in a code of ethics. It's another to require it as formal competency.
We're going to truly meet our Bay goals, and we're going to truly help communities plan for vibrant economies. Resiliency and the long-term sustainability has to be that theme that connects it.
Local governments and infrastructure and nonprofits who are working on this said, this is great that the state brought this to us. We want to help shape this. We want to help govern it, and then we want to participate in it.
Climate change affects everyone in the United States, if not the world. It's just whether or not they understand how it affects them.
It's not just this one event. It actually cascades out from there and impacts people in social ways, economic ways, and environmental ways that are all intermingled.
We credential people to make sure that they are at a certain professional baseline of capacity. In the context of climate change, we're going to be saying, okay, how do we raise that baseline?
Research has shown usually every dollar invested in some sort of a resilience building or adaptation building is generating $6 return on savings. Taking action sooner becomes a no-brainer.
40 years ago, you didn't need to know how to use a computer. Today, you virtually can't have any job without knowing how to use a computer. We can do this in the context of climate change.
It's important that everybody understands the impact we're going to be seeing based on science over the next 50 to 100 years, and that we can make appropriate decisions together to solve these problems.
I didn't realize the music lasted that long at the end, but I didn't want to interrupt it. So as was mentioned, I think at the beginning of the presentation, this is the first statewide Climate Leadership Academy that was put together. And I'm proud to say that I believe we're on our, they call them cohorts. It's not an easy word for me to say, so I'm not going to say it again, but there's 6 of them. And essentially each of them they've grown in size. I think the first one was about maybe between 60 and 70 people, and now we're averaging about 80 to 90 people per class. It's a 6-day curriculum. The first 4 days take you through from everything through greenhouse gas emissions and the effect of those emissions on sea level rise and climate change. We have sessions on financing, we have sessions on human health influence, and in Maryland, the last 2 sessions are really focused on the state and what's going on particularly in Maryland. And at the end of this, there's a credentialing that can occur. So you can test and get a certified climate change professional credential. So one of the things that I'm proud of at transportation is that we've actually had at least 5 of our staff go through this particular Climate Leadership Academy. One of them was the Deputy Secretary of our transportation agency. So it's fantastic, and it's a great way to ensure sustainability at a state level, because it involves not just government officials, it involves locals. We pull in consultants. It's a broad spectrum, which was it's a spectrum that's very similar to that word cloud I showed you earlier. So it's been about 1.5 years into it at this point, and it's been fantastic. You can now have conversations across agencies, and everybody understands the same language. It's kind of like when you have a conference where they talk about water words that work, like how to relate to the community. Now it's sort of like climate words that work, and the messaging is getting out there, and it's infiltrating the agencies. So just briefly, I want to touch on transforming transportation. So as promised, here is my lovely graphic to follow up that wonderful video. So I'm not, I promise you, going to read through every single word on this slide. But basically what I wanted to show you is what I would consider a draft visualization of what we're looking at MDOT. So transportation in Maryland in particular is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is how do we reduce those emissions? So we've done everything from looking at how we're using energy or fuel consumption. One example that I learned of yesterday was MTA, which is our transit administration. We have buses that we used to idle when they were in the stations, and we would burn gas while we were, or biodiesel or diesel fuel while we were idling in the stations. And now we're turning those buses off and plugging them in, so that the emissions are no longer as significant. And we've seen our numbers go down tremendously because of that. Renewable energy, MDOT just put out a master contract for solar PV installation that not only MDOT can use, but other state, local NGOs can leverage that master contract to have solar companies come in and install PV panels on their infrastructure. So looking at ways for us to promote zero emission vehicles, we're installing charging stations along our corridors. We are promoting this concept of electrifying our fleet. We're not ready for electric buses yet. Apparently they're not as reliable as people would like. So, but you know, whenever we can find, we just continue to look for ways to reduce our emissions. In terms of partnerships, we partner with anybody we can. State, federal, we love other people's money. I'm sure you guys do too. So whenever we can foster a relationship that also results in funding sharing, that's fantastic. And non-government agencies, sometimes I think the philanthropic agencies were mentioned earlier, or organizations. There are a number of them out there that will look to partner with state agencies and local agencies to try to further efforts of impacts for climate change. One of the things that we've focused on that I'm going to get into a little more detail on is our asset management program. So we have a very significant inventory of assets. State highways alone has over 10,000 lane miles that they are keeping track of. We have an aviation program, we have the port, we have 6 different modes of transportation that we're responsible for at MDOT, which is a lot of assets. And what we're doing is we're assessing those assets to the vulnerability for sea level rise and climate change impacts. When we have new projects that come out, we're following the CoSmart construction guidelines, and we're elevating where we can and moving new structures and other assets out of the way of the potential projected sea level rise. So part of that is doing a vulnerability assessment. Then we do the benefit cost analysis to see, whether or not it's something that we can afford to do. And if we can't, engineer our way out of it, we learn a way to manage that risk. So it could be changing the function of an existing structure from being an actual office to changing it to a maintenance shed that doesn't store anything that's sensitive, and moving that office space a little further upland. So, and then finally, one of the things that I am going to share with you today is our climate change vulnerability viewer. Partnering with Salisbury University in Maryland, we took our asset inventory and looked at a HAZUS model, which is like a bathtub model for sea level rise projections. And we determined which of our assets, particularly with State Highway, were under the threat of inundation in the years 2050 and 2100 based on different storm levels. So 100-year, 50-year, 10-year, that sort of thing. We're also looking at the siting and design criteria, and we're working very closely with the Coastmark Council on determining whether or not we can build low and strong, whether or not we have a way of elevating specific sections of roadways to help protect against future loss or inability for emergency evacuation routes, those sorts of things. So transportation is in the conversation, which is fantastic. So in terms of currency, so paying for it all, everybody wants to know how you pay for things, right? I'm really excited about the draft legislation that's called America's Transportation Infrastructure Act of 2019. I did not read all 460-some pages of it, or however many it was. I cheated and did Control F and looked for all the times it said resilient. So just for you guys to know, 65 references to resiliency in the Transportation Infrastructure Act. So that was pretty awesome. One of the things that is different this year in that potential Transportation Funding Act is the fact that they're willing to now pay for us to assess our resiliency. Previously, we weren't allowed to do that. So there's actually specific language that establishes a new, what they call a Protect Grant Program, which stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation. So I haven't read it lately. I'm hoping it's still in there. Otherwise, forget everything I just said. But what's great is there's $200 million in there in competitive funding available for DOTs, and that's for planning efforts. So the things that we already started to do on our own dime or through grants from Federal Highway are now going to be available competitively for DOTs across the nation. And then to further the efforts of transportation resiliency, there's another $140 million proposed in resiliency implementation grants. So you get to plan, and then you get to design and construct. What's equally fantastic, and speaks to what Admiral Phillips mentioned earlier, is that it also allows us to spend some of that funding on natural and nature-based features. So we are usually looked at for gray infrastructure, but they're saying, yes, if you can demonstrate that natural and nature-based features provide the protection that you need for your transportation assets, we will cover that, which is fantastic. I guess the second part of this slide is really speaking to the state of our state, I guess. Our governor was recently selected to be the chairman of the National Governors Association. And in his first year, he established an initiative to push for the repair, enhancement, and modernization of aging infrastructure. And it's based on 4 pillars, and I'm not going to go through all 4, but the third is strengthening security and resiliency and protecting America's critical infrastructure. So at a national scale, there is a need for all of us to start considering what we can do for transportation, whether it's in the coastal states, which is what we're here to talk about today, or whether you're talking about heat impacts in the Midwest or wildflowers are pretty, but wildfires in California. Sorry, 1 cup of coffee today. And then finally, the last thing that I am going to do a shameless self-promotion on is the MDOT SHA Climate Change Vulnerability Viewer. And this will give you a little insight into what we're doing to protect our transportation assets. So this is an aerial image of Annapolis. And as I mentioned earlier, Annapolis has had 42 sunny day flooding instances. I don't know if you're chuckling because that's you're near your area. Yeah, okay. So what you see here is actually 2015 data for 100-year storms. So it's showing you where we already have some flooding that occurs. So red is bad. Green is better, but not great, because it still means there's water there. But anything that's in red is showing 2 feet or greater of inundation. Anything in green is 0 to 0.1 feet. So we're already seeing the impacts of storm event flooding and sunny day flooding in Maryland. And this is based on those models that we ran with the Salisbury University. And just to kind of give you some assurance that the data does seem to be good, this is the picture on the right is a recent storm or a recent event in Crisfield. The picture on the right is actually what the model predicted. So you could see that there is standing water on the roadways. The model, based on the storm event that we used, also shows that there's inundation in there. So we're pretty confident that a lot of the data that we're using is accurately predicting the potential for vulnerability. And then finally, just to wrap up with a nod to currency, there's a double pun there, I guess, going Dutch on coastal risk management, but we just recently at MDOT signed up to be a non-federal share partner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Baltimore District, and we're particularly focused on Baltimore City. We have a number of transportation assets in that area. Essentially, the image on the left shows the study area. So we have our MDOT MAA, Aviation Administration, Martin State Airport, as well as the area basically all the way around the inner harbor, from Port Covington to Cox Creek Dredge Material Containment Facility. So the project is going to last 3 years. We actually cost shared a little bit with DNR, Department of Natural Resources, on the scoping effort, and we're right now in the feasibility phase. And I understand that Virginia has a similar effort going on right now, but the great part about this is that it's a 50-50 cost share. So we're putting $1.5 million in, as is the Corps. We're working together to try to figure out where we can have resiliency measures possibly placed that can protect existing city, state, and local infrastructure. And then hopefully, at the end of the feasibility study, we'll be able to go to Congress and say, look what we did, here are some projects, please continue to fund us. And if we move forward with it, it becomes a 65-35 cost share through design and construction. Ultimately, for anything that is an MDOT asset associated resiliency measure, we would be in charge of the operation and maintenance for over the long term. So I guess I wanted to end on a positive note, that there is funding to be had out there, that maybe sometimes the traditional partners you look to for helping with resiliency planning don't come to mind, but transportation is one that you can consider, not only from the standpoint that they typically do get funded, but also they themselves have assets that they need to ensure have a future. So with that, I will end.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, a huge thank you to the VCPC for the invitation today to come all the way down from Rhode Island. There's a bumper sticker that is all over Rhode Island that says, "This car never leaves Rhode Island." And it's actually quite true. So any day that a Rhode Islander gets to, come up to a different state is a good day. So I'm Sean O'Rourke, the Chief Resiliency Officer for the state of Rhode Island. And I think there's a number of other sort of like positions in the room, and I think you could probably level with me that sometimes it can be somewhat of a lonely existence as the Chief Resiliency Officer. So a big thanks for kind of helping us find our tribe here today. Already have had a number of terrific conversations over dinner last night and even this morning, so really looking forward to seeing how we can continue to build on these collaborations across states. There's so many, I think, terrific connections. There's similarities in work and challenges. I think some states are 2 steps ahead, others are sort of following up quickly, others are 2 steps ahead in other areas. So I think there's areas that we're only going to be better kind of through our partnership, and I think that's a big theme of the work today. So I'm going to give a really quick overview of our statewide resilience strategy, affectionately known as Resilient Rhody. And then I'll talk quickly about how we're implementing on that strategy, and that'll be a key theme of my really brief remarks today, about how we are not only looking to the strategy, check the box, but how we're really being thoughtful about the implementation of that strategy. And that's really, I think, the key component of all of the discussions that I've had with many of you. But before I do, I'm contractually obligated to talk about Rhode Island. We refer to ourselves as the fun-size state. The one stat that really struck me a minute ago was 3,200 miles of coastline. We have 400, and we feel really good about that. But we're rich with culture, rich with small towns. Narragansett Bay, very much like Chesapeake Bay, really is kind of the hub of kind of culture as well as natural resources, and really has been not only a natural resource for the state, but really an economic development and really economic driver for our state as well. One of the things that I'll come back to frequently throughout this presentation, and would love to dig in with many of you who work in state government and work with governors, we often have to be strategic about how we're aligning priorities around climate resilience with the governor's priorities, which oftentimes lead with jobs and economic development. So finding ways that we can link the two, there's oftentimes this false choice between economic development or climate resilience. And I think that we need to be better about linking the two. A big talking point that I have is a better prepared Rhode Island is going to be better for business, right? And so if we can start to be able to link those two, and I love that there's a banking panel and a finance panel today that really starts to bring in these other stakeholders who have really not been at the table, is really a fantastic start. So I'm not going to go into each of the data sets, but these are the 6 what we call manifestations of climate change that we're working on and focused on most acutely in Rhode Island. Many similar issues that you're facing in all the other states that are here today: sea level rise, warming air temperatures, changing biodiversity, and then finally precipitation and inland flooding. I know that we're particularly focused on coastal issues here, but I do want to highlight that a lot of our work in coastal states starts and is discussed as being coastal states. A lot of the climate change discussion is about sea level rise, storm surge, but we have enormous other populations in our state that are also feeling the impacts of climate change, and bringing those populations to the table and being able to engage with them directly is critical. I mean, we are the ocean state, right? And so, but our inland communities are like, we don't have anything to do with that climate change stuff. You guys don't care about us. So being able to find how we connect with those communities, and one of those areas that we're doing that is around consistent precipitation modeling. Many of our communities around the state of Rhode Island, post-industrial mill towns. We have aging infrastructure, dams, culverts, and with extreme precipitation events now, we're seeing increased flooding in those towns. And that has been one very strong connection that we started to make in the inland towns with regard to climate change. We've got a heck of a lot at risk, maybe not in the same numbers or scale that many of your other states have. But again, one of the other main connection points that we've had with climate change and talking with all the residents of Rhode Island is around drinking water supply. You can roughly divide Rhode Island into 2 halves, the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. The northern is on surface water, dealing with reservoirs, and you can think about some of the dam implications or the downstream water issues with regard to dam, them playing a flood control role. And then on the southern part of the state, we're mostly on wells or groundwater, and we're dealing with issues of saltwater intrusion right now every single day, and our University of Rhode Island is doing really fantastic work on modeling some of those challenges. Obviously, issues to our state and municipal roadways. The majority of those roadways are municipally owned. We're finding that municipalities are on the front lines. We can do a lot of leadership work at the state level. We can provide that technical assistance, those resources. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the municipalities stepping up and having a leadership role, and the state being a better partner with those municipalities who are strapped for cash, expertise, and resources. Natural and working lands, a key component of our climate resilience strategy. We lost 14% of our state's forest over the last 2.5 years to the gypsy moth infestation with oak trees. And you can imagine that our entire state of Rhode Island is in a wind envelope, and now we have standing dead oaks all across our state, many of which are in the right-of-way, and you can imagine what happens when we have windstorm events. So that's another connection point to many of the other areas of our state. And then finally, placing equity at the center, people at the center of our climate resilience strategy. We struggle with a lot of air quality issues, especially in our metropolitan areas around Providence, and we're really working deeply now with the cities, such as the city of Providence, who just released a fantastic climate justice plan, which links climate resilience and equity and places equity as the lens that they're viewing all of their work through. So definitely check that out if you're interested. As a result of all of these changes that we're seeing on our shores, in our communities, in our forests, Governor Raimondo, much like many of your states, signed an executive order in September of 2017, launching the development of a climate resilience strategy. She gave us all of 9 months to develop a comprehensive, action-oriented climate resilience strategy that works with communities, works across state governments, and said, good luck. But we developed it as a collective, about 50 working group members across state government, environmental organizations, the academic partners around the state, as well as municipal leaders. And I like to say we delivered it 2 days early in July of 2018. So we have been spending the last 14 or so months on trying to not only be great champions for the development of our strategy, but now saying, how do we implement on the 61 actions that we collectively identified and put forward in this strategy so we can continue to drive forward. There's 3 main goals that span across the strategy, and I already heard some of these themes today. Catalyzed planning and vulnerability studies already done. I'll show a slide in a minute of a lot of great work that's been done around the state. But there's always a challenge with you get funding to do plans and studies and strategies, but then oftentimes the implementation dollars aren't directly linked to the planning dollars that you got. There were 54 plans, studies, strategies that I counted that have just been developed around climate resilience since the governor took office 5 years ago. 54. I bet you can guess how many of those moved directly from planning to implementation. There were a couple of really good highlights across the 54, but very few. So we were very keen on focusing on all the great work that has already been done, elevating that work, and then placing action behind it. Identify and prioritize resiliency actions taking control. So instead of looking at things like legislation, recognizing that's a key component of our work, we focus more on policy and the work that our agencies around the state can actually do right now. And then prioritize agency actions that promote cross-agency collaboration and work with municipalities. One implementation action that I'll show in a little bit about how we're developing better resources and technical assistance and funding for our municipalities as a direct result of this strategy. And we all know that with our existing resources, we're not going to be able to attack the scale of this issue, but finding ways that we can strategically sort of stretch every available dollar, every hour of work time from our great staff will allow us to kind of be better coordinated and get additional resources. We've been finding things like permitting processes. There's been a couple of discussions around permitting. In many of our coastal areas, if there's a state roadway that goes through a coastal area, it has to be permitted like 3 or 4 different times by the Department of Environmental Management. The Department of Transportation has to get our Coastal Resource Management Council approval and assent. So why can't we align these permitting processes to have it done once? And I loved the discussion about consistency of data. It's absolutely imperative that we are singing off the same song sheet across our states, and that is one thing we unearthed the development of our strategy was multiple agencies were using different data sets. So this was a quick timeline of how we tried to link some of the key reports and strategies that have been developed in Rhode Island over the past 5 or 6 years, as well as linking with some of the key storm events. And again, we very much wanted to leverage all of the great work that has been done by many across the state of Rhode Island so we can really build that team that is now leveraged into a leadership team for the development and implementation of the strategy. Resilient Roadie looks at 6 key themes. I'm not going to go into each of these, but the first chapter, making the case for climate resilience, in that kind of in the spirit of making sure that we're all singing off the same song sheet. We worked with the Science and Technical Advisory Board, which is part of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which we call the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council. It's 12 agencies. The directors sit and meet quarterly and advise the governor on climate, transportation, and resilience-related issues. And there's a Science and Technical Advisory Board that advises that council. They helped us write this first chapter, and it has been widely adopted now for talking points for the General Assembly, for state agencies. We had some kind of quick hits of some of the key climate change stats that we're seeing around the state. And we just found that taking super wonky climate science, right, that we see like volumes and volumes and volumes of work that goes into, we distilled it into 6 pages. And we thought that that was a critical step to being able to have this issue be accessible to a wide variety of folks. We elevated issues such as natural systems at the same level as critical infrastructure and utilities, and I love that I heard that theme going on today. We placed community health and resilience, really the people, the equity component of our work. Emergency preparedness is no surprise to many of you in the room. And then we also looked at a chapter on financing climate resilience strategy projects as well. And the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank took a key role in developing that strategy, as we know that this stuff is super expensive. So the financing climate resilience projects component is we're working under the assumption that there is no silver bullet. This is absolutely a funding quilt, or someone the other day told me it's sort of more like a silver buckshot. And I think that that's absolutely, we need to come at this from all different angles, federal funding, local funding, being able to stretch existing resources that we have, and then looking at those all new important sort of new and innovative financing mechanisms. We are leading in Rhode Island. As new and innovative means not looking at the new and innovative mechanisms, but looking at ways that we can really stretch how we are already paying for infrastructure. So we did a little exercise of looking at this by chapter and looking at the ways that and mechanisms that we are already paying for improvements across each of those themes, and said we could now leverage climate resilience into each of these. And that has, I think, been a new evolution in work at the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank and across our state agencies to really stretch the heck out of each of these existing functions. And then whatever gap we have left, look to some of those new and innovative financing mechanisms like parametric insurance or environmental impact bonds. But we're going to start with our bread and butter that people know how to do and be able to see if we can push that work forward. One of the challenges that we found in developing the strategy, and we had a conversation about this last night, was the disconnect oftentimes between available funding and projects that are ready to go. And I work with mayors and town managers all over the state of Rhode Island, and the first question I always ask them is, okay, how can we help you? What do you need? And no surprise, first response is, we need more money. The natural follow-up after we say, oh, that's a really good point, right? The natural follow-up is, so what are like the top 3, 4, 5 things you need to do now? And most of the time, the answer I receive is, let me get back to you. I got to talk to my town planner. I got to talk to the city council. I know we have a bunch of stuff. So that's eye-opening, right? That we don't have a pipeline of projects ready to go, yet all we want to do is get more money. And so we are really focused right now on developing a pipeline of statewide projects that we can directly align with new funding and financing that comes available for the state, so we can be better ready to act. One example of this, of how we're trying to build that pipeline, is in 2017, the Department of Environmental Management looked at all of our 19 wastewater treatment plants, which we all know where wastewater treatment plants are, the bottom of the hill, so inherently vulnerable, right? And they looked at each of those facilities and developed a prioritized list of resilience improvements that each of those facilities needs to make to better improve their resilience of that plant. And we are now implementing on those recommendations and making the case for additional funding through the state legislature, through voter-approved bonds. In 2018, the voters in Rhode Island approved for about 70%, and again, the scale is very different in Rhode Island. $47.3 million for green economy and clean water-related issues. This is the majority of the way that we debt finance a lot of our environment and finance-related work, and we're looking now at new sustainable revenue streams that we can put into place, and some of our other states, and Massachusetts, for example, is doing some very interesting work on how to provide sustainable revenue streams. But out of this green bond in 2018, after the release of Resilient Roadie, we had $10 million allocated for specific climate resilience improvements. Without the strategy, without that coordinated effort, the $10 million for climate resilience work would not have happened. So we're trying to have the strategy be a consistent catalyst for additional work. The Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, which I'll quickly mention, which is kind of my day job, is the hub of all infrastructure financing for the state of Rhode Island. We largely, for the first, we're 30 years old this year. For the first 25 years, we managed the state revolving funds around clean water and drinking water, really was the bread and butter of our agency. But when the current governor, Raimondo, took office, she worked with the treasurer, General Treasurer Seth Magaziner, to see if we could expand the impact of the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, recognizing that we have a ton of work to do around aging infrastructure and infrastructure improvements in the state of Rhode Island. And so we expanded our mission and mandate with the help of the legislature to include things like community septic system programs, municipal road and bridge, brownfields, and now over the last year and a half, a deep focus on climate resilience and stormwater project funding. Just since 2015, we've had a whole heck of a lot of impact across the state of Rhode Island, saving taxpayer dollars, getting projects done quicker, and we all know that projects that we do now are not only going to be cheaper, but they're also going to have that sort of protective or adaptive capacity that we're getting many of the questions from some of the rating agencies now at the state level about how we're trying to drive investment in the areas that need it most. So what are some of the innovative initiatives that are underway? I talked about development of the strategy and the all-important implementation of that strategy. I recognized very quickly that climate resilience is everybody's problem, right? It's across all of our state agencies. But the challenge with that is then it becomes sort of nobody's problem. And so we recognize that we need to have defined, focused leadership within each of those 12 Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council agencies, and we have now developed resilience coordinators. So there is a point person with a part of their job description is to focus on the implementation of Resilient Rhody. And that was an enormous, very simple step to be able to have someone who's very focused on this work, in addition to their day job, who can be better advocates to their director, which then at the director at the EC4 meetings can be a better champion from our work, which then the governor can hear the good work we're doing, and it sort of allows us to catalyze more action around the state. We also assigned direct ownership of all 61 actions in the strategy to those resilience coordinators based on the appropriate agencies, and that's really allowed us to have better transparency and action around. I can pick up the phone and call the person at Department of Transportation and say, how are we making progress on that action, on those actions that you said you were going to do? And it's allowed us to have increased follow-up. We've catalyzed $13 million of brand new funding just since this strategy came into place, and that was because we were better able to advocate for the need. If we're able to communicate the need and be better advocates, we're then going to be able to advocate for more funding. But it comes in as a sequential approach. And as I mentioned, we're now looking at sustainable revenue streams. We're not going to be able to debt finance our way out of this issue or look to the federal government for additional grant dollars. We need to find those sustainable revenue streams so entities like the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank can provide below market rate financing to accelerate projects at scale. One really exciting program, which is a direct response to our work with municipalities and that lesson learned of municipalities being on the front lines, is the Municipal Resilience Program. Learning from our region, we look to Massachusetts, who has had a very successful program called the Municipal Vulnerability and Preparedness Program, the MVP program, which was developed in part by the Nature Conservancy in collaboration with the state of Massachusetts to partner on developing pipelines of projects and initiatives that need to get done to better improve the resilience of that municipality, and then be able to provide action funding or grants to kind of, again, complete that all-important arc of pipeline building as well as implementation. We Rhode Islandized that process, and in 2019, we opened it up to all 39 cities and towns in Rhode Island. We selected 5. We ran workshops, the Community Resilience Building workshops with the Nature Conservancy, which has been an amazing partner on this work with the Infrastructure Bank. Ran workshops in those 5 communities, have identified a really robust set of nature-based solutions as well as infrastructure improvements as well as additional resources such as expanding Meals on Wheels programs and connecting it to climate resilience. So really kind of a quite broad selection. And the Infrastructure Bank has put up $2 million of action funding for those 5 communities to implement on projects that were identified. We're going to be doing the same thing in 2020 with another 5 communities. And then the hope is that it was such a wild success that the legislature and the voters of Rhode Island can't help themselves but fund this to go to scale to all 39. So it's the all-important sort of demonstrating success, starting small, being able to provide your lessons learned, replicate, and then be able to scale. And that, I think this is a really good example of how we're trying to implement on our Resilient Ready strategy. And then finally, a stormwater project accelerator, and this comes to the core component of identifying problems and then identifying solutions really effectively. So one of the things that I learned over the last 2 years was the way that stormwater and innovative green infrastructure projects gets funded is largely through grants. Federal grants, state grants, bond funded, but it's largely grant dollars to municipalities and nonprofits. The majority of those projects are reimbursement grants. So organization receives a grant, gets super excited about the $400,000 that they received to do a really exciting bioswale or green infrastructure project, then goes, how am I going to pay the contractor while I wait to get reimbursed? So the organizations and municipalities are running around trying to raise the money to pay the contractor while they already have the money allocated. So at the Infrastructure Bank, we have set up what we call a Stormwater Project Accelerator. It's in essence a bridge loan program to provide the upfront capital to grant recipients for stormwater as well as climate resilience projects in Rhode Island to get projects done better, faster, cheaper. And we are finding in partnerships with our Department of Transportation that by Department of Transportation providing reimbursement grants to organizations to do the projects in support of their EPA consent decree, it's saving about 33% on every project. Because now a large agency isn't out there doing design, bid, build, an organization is, which has better connection to the community. And so we've developed a pretty robust pipeline. We got $3 million in projects over the next 9 months, and now we're expanding to federal EPA dollars, which I think is going to expand this pie even more. So I just wanted to show one example of how we're trying to innovate using existing resources at the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank and how we're trying to drive water quality improvements in collaboration with our municipalities and organizations around the state. So with that, thank you so much for the opportunity today. Check out climatechange.ri.gov. It's our centralized location for all of our climate change work in the state of Rhode Island. And we just released which I'm thrilled about, a dashboard to track our mitigation as well as adaptation related work in the state. This was a long time coming. You can imagine all of the challenges with putting out all the public information about our progress towards goals. But it's the first time now we are directly linking adaptation and mitigation, and that's really the sweet spot of where it needs to happen. We can't be coming at this issue from two sides. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity today.
Well, good morning. You've been very patient sitting here all this time, and I want to say the same thing Sean said, which is climate work is sometimes pretty lonely and pretty darn depressing. And it's just great to be in a room with 250 other people who are worrying about the same thing I'm worrying about. So also, you're always wondering, like, what are the little tidbits you're going to pick up at one of these conferences? I got to say, I got something worth the travel from Boston to here, which is this line, marked by science and not by Sharpies. Man, that's something I'm going to be able to use. So I want to talk about this issue from the point of view of a municipality, Boston, and I'm going to go down into a little bit of the more nitty-gritty of how you actually get projects done and sort of where we are. But I'm going to end with what we haven't done and what we haven't figured out, which is a lot. How many of you have been up Mount Washington in the White Mountain National Forest? Yeah, wow, about a third of you. How many of you drove up? Okay, there, which is okay to admit. So, Washington is, 6,500 feet. It's a big mountain, but you can drive up it, you can hike up it, etc. What we're trying to do now is go up Mount Washington. We're trying to go up Everest, right? And it's that difference, and I think we just need to be aware of that. And I want to talk beginning with partnerships. I run this thing in Boston called the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, and it's a CEO network. It was put together in 2010, and our mission is to support the city's implementation of its climate action plan. We have 36 CEOs on it. They're all C-suite participants. They're either CEOs or EVPs, and it's from all the key sectors, the utilities, big NGOs, et cetera. And the reason this thing came together is back in 2010 when we started, the city was doing its first serious climate action plan, and a local foundation called the Barr Foundation had just committed $50 million to grant making on climate in New England. And so the question in Boston was, where's the business and civic leadership table to have the conversations about the long-term structural changes that are going to happen in the city over the next 30 years for both mitigation and adaptation? It didn't exist, and that's why we put this group together. So we have been intimately involved in both sides of the city's climate action plan, both their adaptation strategy, which is called Climate Ready Boston, and their getting to carbon neutrality, which is Carbon Free Boston. In both these instances, we, the commission, raised about $1 million to actually fund the staffing of these projects and put them in place. And I'm going to talk about the one on the left, which is Climate Ready Boston. Interestingly, the reason this happened was because of two of the members on our commission. One is Brian Koop with Boston Properties. The other is Alan Leventhal, Beacon Capital Partners. These two players control something on the order of 12 million square feet of office space in the city of Boston, and they're both big Class A office developers, and both of them have big holdings in New York City. And in 2012, they went through the Sandy experience on their assets in New York. They came back to Boston totally freaked out and said, oh my God, we have got to get our act together. And so it was out of that we sort of designed the Climate Ready Boston Initiative, put the funding together, hired the staffing, and turned it over for the city to do it. So that's how we got launched on the planning. What the Climate Ready Boston, you can go on the website. The report is 400 pages long. We did what many of you have talked about at state level. We got a consensus forecast. We did a vulnerability assessment, and we put an implementation roadmap together. That then spawned a whole set of secondary projects. We're doing resilience district planning in 5 neighborhoods. We did a feasibility of a harbor barrier, which, by the way, turned out to be a totally bad idea. So we got to take that off the table because you were having these conversations about coastal resilience. I said, well, let's put a barrier across the harbor. For a wide variety of reasons, it's just a terrible idea. And we've done research on financing and research on governance. This has actually emerged into the mayor adopting this vision of a resilient Boston Harbor, and the key is to match, it's this co-benefit, match protection of all 40, we have 42 miles of coastline, not 3,200, even close, but the idea that we're going to have to do protection on virtually all 42 miles of that. As we do, let's improve the public realm. Let's create better access to the waterfront. Let's create more green space, et cetera. So let me what I'm going to do is just get into the nitty-gritty on one of these districts so you have a sense of where we are and what we got to. So the percentages on this map, this is the city of Boston. If you know Boston, Boston is 30% fill. Basically, had 1 foot of freeboard back in 1900, right? Well, we've gotten 11 inches of sea level rise since then, so you can imagine what that looks like. The percentages are how much of these neighborhoods will flood in 2070 with a 1% flood. So the percentages are pretty high, right? So clearly, this is a city that just won't work if we don't do something. There are 5 neighborhoods that represent about 90% of that coastal flood risk, and I'm talking about coastal flooding, not cloudburst and not extreme heat, which are 2 other separate issues. So I'm going to dive into sort of what it looks like in one of these districts and give you a sense of where we are. So this is a Seaport district. On the left is a Seaport in 2004, and now you see it today, 15 years. This is the most vulnerable place in the city of Boston, and this is where the vast majority of commercial development has happened in the last 50 years. And people say, well, why are we permitting this stuff? Actually, this stuff got permitted 15 years ago and was going through the pipeline before sea level rise was really an issue. And it is very high risk. So this is the map of 2070 or later. This is with the 3 different colors. And I think what's really important is the dark color is the average monthly high tide. So by 2070, you can see how much of this place is underwater at least once a month. This is the chronic versus acute problem. You can manage the acute. It's very difficult to manage the chronic. So what we ended up doing was diving down to the next level, which is where are the flood pathways? So this is a map of where the actual flow will be. And this thing doesn't have a little beeper on it, does it? But anyway, I'm going to talk up in the 100-acre master plan. You can see that's the primary flood area. And what's really important is that's how the water gets into a whole nother neighborhood of Dorchester. And so I'm going to concentrate on that and then the top, which is where the near-term projects are. So what we did is, in addition to the flooded flow analysis, then there's the question of what are the protection concepts, which is what are we going to do and where's it going to go, right? And the where's it going to go matters a lot, right? Because in a lot of cases, the right thing to do is put it on a roadway. Then the people, who are in the water, perpendicular to the water, and a lot of Boston shoreline, you got these wharves that are they're basically on their own. So do you do it out there? Do you do it someplace in? So we have protection concepts for this entire district. We have protection designs. These are not really detailed engineering designs, but we do have a theory about what they will look like. And we have some detailed cost estimates on what the projects will look like in each one of these areas. And just for perspective, in South Boston, the projects that need to get done by 2030, just in South Boston, it's about $100 million worth of projects. Well, 2030, if you think concept, design, engineering, permitting, procurement, is like the day after tomorrow, right? And we need $100 million in one of the 5 neighborhoods in Boston. So these grandiose state plans of, oh, we're going to have $1 billion over 10 years, it's probably going to take us $5 billion at least in the city of Boston to do that. And some of this stuff needs to happen, and needs to happen right now. So that gets us to paying for it all. I have a slide at the end which will give you a reference to these, but the nonprofit that I also run, the Innovation Network for Community, we've done 4 resilience studies, and one of them we dove deep into 8 cities, and the cities were Boston, Charleston, Hoboken, Miami, Miami Beach, New York City, Norfolk, and San Francisco. These were cities that were already spending money, and so the question is, how are they doing this? And this is a list of, not surprising things that they're doing. I'll just talk about a couple of these for the city of Boston and what we're doing in Boston. Generate local revenue. So the city has now committed 10% of its annual capital budget to resilience. That comes to about $40 million a year. They have about a $400 million a year resilience budget. Great. What really matters is, how do they define that? And are they just going to take projects that are already in the pipeline and label them resilience projects and make sure they all add up to $40 million? Or is there going to be $40 million to do new stuff? But, it's still positive. We have a AAA bond rating. We have actually a lot of debt capacity. We've talked to a couple of the municipal finance people who are headquartered in Boston, and they basically said, look, Boston could finance $5 billion worth of projects over 30 years and really not have a problem doing it. So I guess that's the good news. But nobody's acted on that. There's no proposal for a general obligation bond or a green bond of any kind that adds significant capital to us. The city is rapidly taking the resilience strategies and implementing them in their development processes. So they are in the process of adopting a future flood overlay district based on 40 inches of sea level rise by 2070. So now if you're a developer coming to the Article 80 approval process, you have to demonstrate how your asset will be resilient over that time frame with that level of sea level rise, and they've taken every parcel in the city, put it on an online map so you can see what the actual, actual depth is. So good start. Well, what does that get you? That gets you protection of new projects, right? It really doesn't solve the problems that we have with the existing structure. Department of Public Works now has a set of standards on these projects from a right-of-way point of view, design standards, which is good. So if we're going to do a protection strategy that goes across the public realm, we have some standards about how it's going to do it. By the way, all 8 of the cities that we talked to on finance all had some element of quote-unquote finance innovation. Every single one of them was preceded by we're studying, we're exploring, or we're considering. Like nobody had actually implemented anything. I have not yet found a district resilience investment strategy anywhere in the United States of America in any serious kind of way. As I said, there are a couple of bills in the legislature, but they're not even close to the scale that we need. And I would say, consistent with Sean, though, this is a developmental process. We couldn't be having the conversation on these 4 bullets today if we hadn't gone through the broad planning, the planning at the district scale, building the portfolio of projects, and doing the cost estimates on them. Because we wouldn't be able to make the case that we had to do these things. So here's what we haven't done. Governance structures. Who does the work? Everybody worries about where the money comes from. Let me tell you, just as important is who does this stuff. There's no entity in the city of Boston that has coastal protection in their mission. We have a water and sewer commission that handles all of the stormwater, drainage, all the green infrastructure stuff. We have the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority that does water supply and wastewater management. So who's going to build this stuff? $5 billion of capital projects is not a trivial thing. Who are the engineers? Who are the designers? Who are the project managers? Who's going to do the procurement? All that kind of stuff. Nobody has any idea how that's going to get done at this point in time. We don't have any real idea of how we're going to pay for it yet, in terms of financing. We got a $10 million FEMA grant. We were very happy with that. We matched another $10 million. We have $20 million. We have another $100 million that we have to come up with in the next 7 to 8 years. The third question was a little wonky, which is how do these plans get codified? These plans that you've seen are consulting projects. They're a plan. They don't yet show up in a zoning. They don't yet show up in a plan development area. And if you look at even the zoning overlay district, what's it going to do for us? It's going to say what you have to do when you have a project. It still doesn't address how we implement these protection as a public realm kind of decision. And then last, how do we get this aligned with Massport, the utilities, Eversource, National Grid, Verizon, all of the infrastructure players. So we've made lots of progress, but we're actually now really at the point where we have to call the question and figure out how we get resources at the scale that we need to get. Just want to end to just say there is in the slides a link to the 4 reports that we've done on resilience finance. One of them is, by the way, on the third rail of climate adaptation, which is managed retreat that nobody really wanted to talk about. I hope those are useful to you. Thank you very much.
First off, that was a lot of information, and I hope that you took a lot of notes. I did, and I think there's a lot of good things for us to learn here in Virginia from our 3 colleagues in the other states. We don't have a lot of time for questions, so if you have a question, if you'll go ahead and raise your hand, let these folks find you. But I want to start with one question because I do think that they've given us a lot of information. Let me just ask them if they would summarize 2 or 3 key takeaway points that they think would be beneficial for Virginia as we move forward. There's a lot of fanfare when we roll out these plans, but as you just heard from our presenters, going from planning to action is the most difficult part. And so maybe we could just run down the line here and ask you if you would, just to give us a couple of suggestions as we move forward so we can learn from your experience.
Okay. I think one of the things that is critical is making sure that, and I think it was mentioned in everybody's presentation, that we're all kind of playing from the same sheet of music. And part of that is taking the time to build a community of practice within your government agencies and at the local level, and really educating the folks that have a direct impact on, future planning in your state. So I would concentrate on your public works at the local level. I would concentrate on your planning organizations and the MPOs that you have, and making sure that you have folks at the table when it comes to emergency management. There's a lot of coordination that has to happen, and I think the biggest challenge is to make sure that everybody understands and appreciates what their role is in making it a success. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would just suggest that we have to, as quickly as we possibly can, get to the point of accepting that we have a new class of infrastructure that we have to organize a system around. In Boston, we spent a lot of your money, $22 billion on our big dig, putting one highway underground. We spent $6.5 billion cleaning up the Boston Harbor. It used to be one of the dirtiest harbors in the country. It's now one of the cleanest. We spent $500 billion building the interstate system. In 15 years, from 20 to 2015, water agencies in the U.S. spent $500 billion on water infrastructure. We can do this. This is not like crazy, but we have to accept the fact that it's a new infrastructure class. The Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, our regional transit, they have a $7.5 billion 5-year budget. They don't freak out when they have to do another subway stop. They have 22 different funding sources. They blend together, and they know how to do them. We just have to accept that this is an obligation we have. We have to create a system to do it and get on with it and stop trying to get resilience for free, because it just is not going to happen.
Oh, man. So I think my big lesson learned from our work in Rhode Island has been all of our planning work needs to be ambitious yet achievable. There is incredible value in being able to show demonstrated progress, not only to our bosses, but to the municipalities and most importantly to the residents of the state. So linking, again, that planning to implementation is absolutely critical, and kind of being able to be one step ahead of thinking about implementation as you're developing the strategy. The other piece I will allude to, as John mentioned, a lot of our professions and the associated professions that we work with across our agencies don't have a strong background in finance and how things get paid for. And I think that that's a missing gap, not only in the education of a lot of our professional areas, but also just in the sort of job descriptions and how we're getting projects done. So including climate resilience financing as a part of design is absolutely critical. We think about it oftentimes at the end. We develop the whole strategy, we develop the plan, we develop the pipeline, we go out for procurement, then we recognize how the heck are we going to pay for this? Having the folks who can help us structure deals at the table as part of design is absolutely critical. So making it a core component of the planning and design process is key.
I think we're really close here. I don't know, is there someone out here that already has a microphone and they're ready to have a question? Okay, here we go. We'll take this question right here.
Good morning. Thank you all for a very full pack of information. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I would love to see all of your PowerPoints. John, you touched on it briefly, but wondered if both Sandy and Brody
That's fine, Brody.
can focus a little bit on how you brought this to the business community and who were your private partners in making sure that there was a broad swath of support from both private and public organizations.
I guess I'll go first. She remembered my name because it's associated with a hurricane, just so don't feel bad, Sean. So in transportation, we typically don't do a lot of direct partnerships with the private sector. A lot of our work is done with other government agencies and using federal and state funding. However, in looking at stormwater management, which is a component of flood control, and looking towards the future, we are starting to develop these public-private partnerships. I think the approach we've taken is we have issued what we call a request for information. So we'll send out an RFI. For example, we have a pilot project, I'm not supposed to say pilot, demonstration project that includes, what do we call it? It's called CMAC. It's basically smart ponds. And essentially it leverages the cloud data for rainfall and allows you to control the release of water in existing stormwater ponds, and possibly hold back additional water to prevent excessive downstream flooding and erosive forces during storm events. So we put out an RFI and asked the business community, what do you think about this? What are some of the challenges that are going to happen if we put this out for you to provide this service to us? And it would be, I would think, the same approach when we look to do resiliency planning and broad-scale implementation of our protection of assets in the coastal areas, where we could say, this is what we're looking to do. These are the types of features we'd like to incorporate. We have the Bay TMDL. We have an MPDS MS4 permit, so we have a target reduction for that. We would be looking to find those co-benefits that were mentioned earlier and put that out as an RFI, get feedback from the business community on whether or not they feel that it's something that's feasible, and then follow that up with an RFP and a selection plan, the traditional procurement process. But that's one way we've approached it when we have looked to do work with the private sector.
Sean, do you want to add anything, or John?
I would just say that I just wouldn't hesitate to bring the business community, particularly the commercial real estate industry, in as soon as possible. We found that they get this stuff because it's risk. This is risk management, and they're willing to pay a lot of money to make it happen. In that Seaport district, there was a 6-acre parcel that's part of the Gillette manufacturing facility that just got sold to Related Beal. They paid $240 million for 6 acres of dirt in the most vulnerable area in the entire city of Boston. Well, why? Because they figure this is like not this is a doable. They expect that we're actually going to act on that protection strategy. So I would and well, yeah, maybe that was a bad bet on their part, but there are a lot of developers who are like way ahead of the city regulatory strategy. They are integrating this stuff into their design. Bring them in and bring them in as soon as you can. Don't be afraid of talking to them because they get it, and they get it really fast because they're serious business people.
It's been a big blind spot in our Rhode Island work, and we recognized this really early on with the development of our strategy. And we are now trying to actively engage with the business community. We're doing this through some of our work at the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. We're trying to formally integrate climate risk into our loan origination process. And we start looking at who pays for a lot of these municipally based projects. It's oftentimes they're based on the tax base. And in our coastal communities, it's 80 to 90% commercial and residential. And so the property owners in the most vulnerable areas in these municipalities understand what their risk is more than they'll let you know. And so being able to unearth some of those key challenges, they've been really instrumental in starting to help us understand how we structure that process and what are the right questions to ask, because they're critical to keeping the lights on in the town or city hall in which they reside.
I'm afraid that we don't have any time for additional questions. Let me just make a couple last comments here. I think there were many lessons that were shared with us today. I just jotted down a few real quickly. You know, one of them was demonstrate success and then scale it up. Having the departments of transportation involved was very important. Engagement, equity is a big issue that needs to be addressed in each of the plans. Having a plan is going to be important in order to draw philanthropic dollars. Assignment of responsibility was a key thing that I think Sean touched on in terms of agency folks that were given responsibility, and so that there was an identified person to go to. Using existing resources, broadening the education, you know, the leadership council or academy was an interesting idea. Business partnerships, co-benefits, and we could go on and on. This was a great panel to start us off today. Please give them a round of applause.
Thank you all very much. As Joe said, what a terrific panel. We're going to take a quick break. There's some snacks for you all. And please plan on being back here by 11:15. Thanks.